Welcome to In, a podcast series dedicated to contemporary visual art practices. In is broadcast by New Local Space, a microgallery and contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This episode is brought to you with the generous support of the British Council Caribbean and will be hosted by a writer and independent curator, Nicole Smythe-Johnson. Today's episode is a conversation about the British Black art movement of the 1980s and its legacy today, with guests Alberta Whittle, Anna Arabindan-Kesson, Janice Chetty, Paul Goodwin, Someshwar Sharma, and Tiffany Boyle. Alberta Whittle is a Barbadian artist, researcher, and educator. Foregrounding her research is an analysis of creative strategies employed to question the authority of post-colonial power, its implications, and its legacy. Recent exhibitions include a 2011 commissioned by the Museum of London for her discursive project, See No Evil, Hear No Evil, Speak No Evil, which brought together migrant groups to examine themes of displacement, citizenship, and xenophobia. The Johannesburg Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale, Framer Framed, Amsterdam, Royal Scottish Academy and David Dale Gallery, Scotland, Beaux-Arts, Belgium, National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, and at the Goth-on-Main and Constitution Hill, South Africa. Since 2016, Whittle has been a committee member of Transmission Gallery in Glasgow. Anna Arabindan-Kesson is an assistant professor of African American and Black diasporic art with a joint appointment in the Department of African American Studies. She specializes in African American, Caribbean, and British art with an emphasis on histories of race, empire, and transatlantic visual culture in the long 19th century. Her scholarship lies in conceptualizing the ways Black diasporic art compels us to rethink constructions of national identity, racial formation, and cultural production. These interests are explored in her current book project, The Currency of Cotton, Art, Empire, and Commerce, 1780 to 1900. Recent commissions include an essay for the Tate Modern Gallery in London on the portraiture of Barclay L. Hendricks, and by the Philadelphia Photo Art Center to write a catalogue essay on street photography and the work of Hank Willis Thomas. As a curator, she has been involved in several exhibitions, including the 2009 traveling exhibition, Embodied, Black Identities in American Art from the Yale University Art Gallery. She currently serves on the Board of Advisors of the Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia, as well as New Local Space. Janice Chetty was born in St. Lucia and arrived in the UK with her mother and older brother in the 1960s. She's a London-based researcher, writer, and consultant who works across academia and cultural policy with a PhD in cultural studies. Chetty has published widely on issues of visual culture and difference. Between 2002 and 2015, she was keeper of the Panchayat Special Collection along with Shaheen Murali. She's currently an associate lecturer at University of Greenwich. She was visiting senior lecturer in art history and art education at the Errol Barrow Center for Creative Imagination at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Barbados from 2009 to 2010. Between 2005 and 2009, she was the lead consultant for the Heritage Diversity Task Force, Greater London Authority, and associate editor of Embedding Shared Heritage at the Greater London Authority. Between 2006 and 2008, she was a core member of the Dress and African Diaspora Network collaboration between Victoria and Albert Museum, University of California, Davis, and Chelsea College of Art, University of the Arts, London. From 2000 to 2005, she was Arts Humanities Research Council Research Fellow on Translating the Image, Cross-Cultural Contemporary Arts at Goldsmiths College, University of London, led by Professor Irit Rogoff. Paul Goodwin is a curator, urbanist, and researcher based in London, UK. He is of Jamaican parentage, and his work crosses the intersecting fields of contemporary art, curatorial practices, and urban theory. He's currently developing writing and curatorial projects on the following problematics: rethinking radical approaches to transnationalism in contemporary art and design research, exploring the generative potential of aesthetic strategies around blackness, urbanism, and immateriality in Africa and the diaspora, and developing artistic strategies to address climate change in the Swiss Alps. He teaches on the Fine Art program at Chelsea College of Arts, University of the Arts, London, and is a visiting teacher on the MA in Art in Public Affairs at l'École Cantonale d'Art du Valais in Sierre, Switzerland. Sumeshwar Sharma is a curator based in Mumbai who co-founded the Clark House Initiative in 2010, a curatorial collaborative project located in an old office of the Thakur Shipping Company. Clark House Initiative seeks to address the freedom that, quote-unquote, you don't yet know you don't have. Sharma's interests include alternate art histories and projects informed by socioeconomics and politics that often include cultural perspectives, immigrant culture in the Francophone, vernacular equalities, and movements of Black consciousness in culture. Sharma is currently a resident of Parasite, Hong Kong. Tiffany Boyle is a curator and writer working between research and exhibition making. As a researcher and curator, her interests lie at the intersection between art history and the body. The still image, representation, skin, whiteness, movement, notation, pose, performativity, sport, dress, and embodiment. Together with Jessica Carden, in 2009, Boyle founded the curatorial project Mother Tongue. Since 2009, Mother Tongue has produced exhibitions, film programs, discursive events, essays, and publications, working with galleries, museums, archives, festivals, and national organizations, primarily in Scotland and Sweden. Mother Tongue's practice in exhibition making intersects with research interests such as post-colonialism, language, translation, heritage, race, indigenousness, migration, and movement. Boyle is currently a recipient of a Paul Mellon Center Research Support Grant to undertake archive and collection research into the presence and exhibition histories of artists of color in Scotland.
I'm going to start with a question for Janice and Paul especially. How do you define the British Black art movement? When was it? Who was active? What were some of the conceptual, aesthetic, and political concerns that were characteristic of it?
I guess there are various conflicting definitions of the British Black art movement, but I would say that it emerged in the late 70s and early 1980s as a specific series of practices and discourses that kind of emerged at a particular conjunctural moment in British culture, politics, and society that emerged between the 1960s and the 1990s. So there was a moment of economic crisis, a breakdown of the post-war kind of social contract between workers and capital. There was the rise of Thatcherism and a right-wing neoliberal market-based policies that affected poor communities and Black communities in particular, the aggressive policing of Black communities, and the way that the question of race emerged within debates about immigration to really define that moment. In a way, very similar to where we're living now. And basically, I think Black artists or Black British artists, African, Caribbean, Asian, because Black in that context was seen as a political concept, not an ethnic concept. It emerged really to express protest, to express political resistance in a way to some of the things that were happening at that time. That's a kind of a broad-based definition, right? There's a conflicting definition that some people use, which is based around the fact that Black art and the Black art movement is art produced by Black people, or art that's produced by people of African, Asian, Caribbean descent, which is a very broad definition because it would include everything produced by any Black person. So I think it's quite problematic. So I mean, that's how I would define it. For me personally, I think it's a kind of a self-consciously radical response to a set of political, economic, and social questions that emerged at the end of the 1970s in Britain.
I think we need to look at two things. I think the way the concept of Black art circulates about in institutions now, particularly within the UK and perhaps internationally, I think is quite different to perhaps what was considered the kind of internal dynamics of a number of very disparate artists who had very diverse practices and who engaged with a wide range of subjects. And I think that there is widely associated, like the moment would be around the formation of the Black Art Group, which Marlene Smith, Keith Piper, Eddie Chambers, Donald Rodney, Claudette Johnson were constituted of. And I think those circulations are sometimes contradictory, because if you look at the historical record, there are a whole range of artists, some who emerged and were there for a very brief phase of time, and they had a very diverse range of practices. And I think that's the kind of conflicting thing. And often, and I think this is still the case, is that there was a tendency to try and push those artists into some kind of sociological or societal reading of the work itself, without actually looking at its cultural and aesthetic autonomy. And I think that that is mostly true or classically read when people talk about Tam Joseph's school report. That is primarily read as to look at the situations around what was happening, particularly to Caribbean young people in the education system at the same time. However, its relationship to pop art, its relationship to Caribbean carnival aesthetics is never really talked about. So I think that we need to kind of look at those conflicting ways of reading that work and the ways in which they're interested, but actually look at the very diverse board of practices around this kind of very loose, amorphous term arranges, without necessarily trying to fit it in to these kind of like neats, either in terms of chronological things or in terms of kind of practices. So I think that perhaps maybe that's where Paul and I would differ.
Do you remember the point in time where you felt like you could identify the British Black Art movement as a movement or a shift? When was that moment for you?
I'd come out of, I was a member of a young women's collective, late 1970s, and it was partly a feminist collective of young women writing about issues without themselves. And then gradually, as the Black feminist movement moved, I became engaged with Organisation of African Asian Women's Movement, which was called OBAT. And so there was lots of creativity and kind of responses to try and work through some of the issues around what it was to be Black, what it was to be, feminist. And also a lot of us had come through anti-racist struggles around those times. There was a lot of kind of Caribbean literature. Louise Bennett was often a kind of person. Gavin Yante's the colouring book was around kind of the anti-apartheid struggle. But for me personally, the first time I encountered was actually at the Africa Centre in 1982, and I think that was a Pan-African connection. And shortly after that, I met Black Audio, who I started working with in around 1984. So it was kind of an awareness that something was going on. I think it was only really until about 1985, 1986 that you could actually talk about something which is kind of identifiable, which historically would be seen as identifiable. I'm not sure that because you engage in it, that it was identified as a movement. I think that came much later on, when there was certain kind of, particularly when Stuart Hall entered the debate in the late 1980s around trying to work about this. But I think as somebody who was involved with those artists in that very early period, it wasn't until it was being labelled institutionally that you began to think of this thing as something which was identifiable. That's my personal experience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I personally, being a young man, the early exhibitions and events that Janice mentioned, I personally didn't experience. I've experienced them really as a researcher, later on, having researched various exhibitions and catalogues. I think the first exhibition that made me aware of the existence of a Black Art movement was probably Rashid Areen's The Other Story at the Hayward Gallery in 1989. I can vaguely remember a lot of the kind of media presence. I saw the exhibition. At that time, I wasn't really into visual arts, but I was aware that it was a very important exhibition. And as Janice said, that exhibition was in '89. It was a kind of institutional recognition of the existence of African, Caribbean, and Asian artists in Britain. There was many disagreements as there were agreements. It was quite well known that, for example, Claudette Johnson led a number of Black women into a kind of separate meeting or within the meeting to talk specifically about black women's practices, because that was in a way marginalised in some of the discussions that were very kind of seen as very masculinist, focusing on black men and political, a very political, narrow political definition of black art. So yes, I would agree with everything that Janice has said. Really, I think it's the term itself did become institutionalized, and there were a number of exhibitions that started to institutionalize it. For example, the Into the Open exhibition at the Mappin Art Gallery in Sheffield in 1984, where Lubena Himid and Poga Caesar were invited by the Sheffield City Arts Department and selected, I think, 22 artists, including Eddie Chambers, Keith Piper, Sonia Boyce, and themselves as well. And that was really one of the first, even before The Other Story, one of the first engagements by a mainstream art gallery with black art. But, you know, there were obviously many exhibitions by the Black Art Group, by people like Eddie Chambers. Lubena Himid had the Elbow Room Gallery, where black artists were really, because of their exclusion from the art system, were very much involved in showing their own work and creating spaces. And I think that's really important to recognise, that there was a kind of a moment within black art where, before it became institutionalised, where black artists were very much in control of their own, of showing their work.
I want to get a little bit more specific now. Janice, there was a lot of conflict and protests within England in the 1980s. Police brutality and state violence targeted at black people living there. How was this being dealt with by artists at the time?
Marlene's piece of work, obviously, which is classically deals with one of the police raids where Cynthia Jarrett was shot in Brixton and was disabled, is a piece of work. And obviously, Territories by Sankova deals specifically with police violence. But I think that what I think needs to be to the fore is actually an engagement to try and work out what that practice might be. So primarily they are aesthetic engagements with, for want of a better word, a modernity or a modernism, which looks at how is that experience, which is not something which is about sociological, but actually looks at this as a range of kind of aesthetic and cultural responses, which is wide enough to include things which are referenced outside the Western Centre. So again, going back to Tam Joseph, that reading, which is very much around carnival and the way in which the Blue Devil, or that kind of painting of the face, is implicit to a kind of notion of carnival practice, becomes imbued in a pop art language, which is the comic strip. So there's all these kind of engagements which are looking at how the voice of the other, for want of a better word, reinscribes the kind of archival narratives which are going on. So I think a lot of the work, even though they are dealing with what that is to be black, are also an attempt to actually talk about a different kind of aesthetic relationship to that work, which is both rooted in, because they're all trained in Western art schools, but looking at how that practice can actually change. And so that the diversity of the practice is also a response to the inability of that kind of very strict Greenbergian modernism, which is about that it has to be very pure, nothing outside the space of the canvas can have any kind of society references. How do you work with that? How do you begin to reinscribe that? And obviously it has a lot of relationship to what was happening around feminist art practice, around performance, around different uses of material, around the importance of the voice, and also the importance of screen-based art. How can that video become scratched and mixed to have a multiplicity and multi-layered voices? So I think what I'm trying to get away from is that reading, and that actually these are just young angry black people responding to something. My argument is that if you look at the multiplicity of practices, there are intense aesthetic debates around what's going on, which about a language which cannot or will not allow a kind of colonial or post-colonial discussion around it. And that's really primarily what I would argue is going on, is that how do artists begin to have an aesthetic autonomy and claim that space as not a societal problem, but as an artist. And I think that's what people have tended to miss, because we were always, growing up in the 1970s, we were always the problem. And to actually claim that space of an artist, which is engaged with the aesthetic and cultural debates, is it in itself a political act without necessarily being directly engaged in any kind of response to that. And I think that's one of the problems that the work has been, is that it's always about the external without rather looking at what the aesthetic issues and the kind of practices that are going on in and of themselves, and why certain practices which were considered art practices needed a kind of different language, which was beyond just thinking about, you know, painting on the walls or kind of very narrative based video art. How do you have a multiplicity of voices when you are engaged with debates which draw from 3 or 4 continents in relationship to that, and languages which are perhaps based within that? So I think that, and some of the questions that needs to be turned on its head, is that how it's not a response to that. It's actually, I think, of the ways in which the ways in which art practice was taught at, particularly at the end of the late 1970s, in this very kind of dry, modern, you know, very art for art's sake, and that there was nothing engaged. That how do you break into that, and how do you begin to talk about other things and other relationships within that? So it's beyond just responses to that. It's wider questions of how is Black subjectivity represented within the society, which only sees it as a problem? How is Black desire represented when it's only ever seen as a problem?
I would like to know, and also Paul, from your research, were artists, thinkers, activists outside of the UK who are in similar struggles being looked at within this moment as well, especially Black spaces internationally? Do you think that Black British artists felt a sense of connection to these spaces? And of course, I welcome any examples that come to mind.
I mean, I think the most important example actually is just a stepping stone from you, which is the 3rd Biennale in Havana, which is cited now as the beginning of a global arts movement. And actually, it was Shaheen Murali of the Panchayat Collective who organised a group of Black and Asian artists to go to that collective, to that Biennale. So already, and that was really the only international space that Black artists could actually be invited to within that time. So I think that the idea of thinking as around a global connection, thinking about dialogues with the global South, became really important post that moment. And that moment's really sort of not really engaged with in the ways in which Black artists were present within that Biennale, and the way that Biennale itself was innovative in a whole range of ways about disrupting the kind of previous Biennale ways of thinking about the world. So I think if you look at very specifically what's happening in Havana in 1989, and the ways in which that talks about a kind of global South having aesthetic autonomy outside the West, that's actually really an important moment that we need to think about. And obviously there are other moments which come out of that, but I think that relationship to the Caribbean and to Britain and to thinking about a new way of engaging within the art world actually is for me a really important moment.
Yeah, I would add to that many of the artists that I've spoken to in my research who were active at that time actually spoke about studying in art schools where there was a lack of access to resources about black art, for example, internationally. Many of them were not until the late 80s, etc., going to the 90s, when people like Adrian Piper and David Hammond became perhaps a bit more well known. Many of the artists didn't have access. They will often tell you that they weren't aware, for example, of black art histories in Britain. They were not so much aware of people like Arabindan-Kesson or Frank Bowling or some of the earlier artists. Some of them had contact, but many didn't. So often, much of the sources came through popular culture, through film, through cinema. So, for example, and also through some of the European modernist art history that they would have encountered at art school. So, for an example of that is Eddie Chambers' Destruction of the National Front around 1979 to 1980, which is a kind of collage of a swastika draped in a kind of British flag that eventually kind of dissolves, in a kind of in a serial kind of formation, and that obviously draws on collage, draws on the kind of modernist techniques of dissonance or breaking with the past that emerged in the early 20th century, but kind of brings that into the political context of Britain at that time, where fascism and racism were on the march, right? So, but having said that, so I mean, there was a sense in which popular culture, if you look at some of Sonia Boyce's earlier works as well, some of the pastel drawings, again, she references cinema, references film, references popular culture. I think Janice makes a good point that, things like the Havana Biennale and artists going there and seeing a broader international context of artists from the quote-unquote third world making works starts to become quite influential.
Anna, your work attempts to untangle historical constructions of global connection and their reappearance in contemporary art of Black diaspora. Could you comment on links and parallels you've found within the Black British art movement and artistic or political movements elsewhere, chronologically and ideologically?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I want to say jumps off some of the things that Janice and Paul have mentioned, particularly in this negotiation that Janice was describing between, how we talk about these artists in terms of politics, but also aesthetics. And I think for me, the broader history of colonialism and imperialism, and then the sort of the legacies of that in the Commonwealth have really shaped the way I have been looking at British Black artists and the ways their artworks have maybe created ripple effects or resonances within the broader post-colony, I guess. So I was thinking in terms of some of these diverse practices that Janice was mentioning, we could think about the ways artists have approached media like photography, and I'm thinking of artists like Ingrid Pollard, and the way she turns photography back onto itself in terms of how it's depicting quote unquote the other, how it's depicting landscape, and she sort of excavates the aesthetics of photography, but also is excavating questions around alienation, the relationship between identity and place. And you can see similar, I think, connections between her work and artists like Lorna Simpson or Australian artist Tracy Moffat. Both these women also use photography to sort of question art history's history, but also to perhaps speculate on new possibilities of constructions of identity and new possibilities for the aesthetics of photography itself. I was also really interested in how artists like Labeina Hamid talks about and thinks about appropriation and collage. These are very modernist art histories and modernist aesthetics, but she uses them in very interesting ways in relation to archives and archival history. She creates collages, she actively works with forms of cutting and pasting. And these are aesthetic forms, tap into vernacular forms of culture, pop culture, pop art. And you can see, I think, some of those questions being looked at again in work by artists like Hank Willis Thomas, even Cara Walker. There's another Australian artist called Brooke Andrew. I think all of these artists are really interested in the archive as source, as subject, but also in the ways that the archive and particular archival histories which have been marginalized or erased from art history, how these sort of silenced histories can give us other aesthetic languages. And we were talking about art exhibitions and biennales, and the most recent biennale, there was a New Zealand artist called Lisa Rehana who created, I think it's a 30-minute video piece called Pursuit of Venus, where she literally reanimates the archive. We can also think about some other themes that emerge, maybe, cross over between different countries and also different times. Think about artists like Frank Bowling and Hugh Locke, who are very different, obviously, in the medium they're using, in their approaches to history, but they're both very interested in time and also how temporality and migration shapes experiences of identity, but also how that challenges these very nationalistic art histories, and these genealogies have shaped how we think about, as Janice was talking about, think about these modernist questions around, what is on the surface, what is on the canvas, what happens outside the frame. And so I think, artists like Bowling and Hugh Locke really open up, or have opened up, sculpture and painting to question what we think of in terms of figuration, what we think of in terms of looking at self. How do we see place? How do we see the body, the Black body? And I think there are other artists, that we might talk about in relation to Locke and Bowling, such as Norman Lewis. Also, in terms of the kind of broader Commonwealth, we can think of artists like Gordon Bennett, Albert Namatjira, artists who also were working with these modernist histories and these modernist aesthetics, but really trying to expand where those aesthetics can take us. And I think too with Hugh Locke, the way he's thinking about sculpture, as a practice and almost as a kind of found practice too, is really important. We can see these kinds of interventions also in the art of Gordon Bennett, Vernon Aki, Fiona Foley, and artists like Daniel Boyle. And these are artists, who are working in Australia, but you might also think about Ebony Patterson. There are a lot of, I think, there are a lot of interactions and intersections that we can see.
Sumesh, could you comment on some of the links you've come across, especially as it relates to your interest in charting or uncovering alternate art histories? From your position in South Asia, can you talk about movements of Black consciousness internationally?
Hi everyone, it is extremely interesting to hear Janice, Paul and Anna. And my intervention here comes from a sense of having very inadequate knowledge about the Black Arts movement. I did not experience it. I was not even born when it began, and I've hardly been in Britain. But I've heard a lot about it, a lot from artists such as Sunil Gupta and others, even Rashida Ain, on the contours of the Black Arts movement and its kind of membership. For me, my interest arose from my own study of the Dalit arts, of the Dalit solidarity movement, which began in the 1970s as the Dalit Panther Party, which was actually begun by poets, playwrights, and artists in Bombay. Their first manifestation was called Black Independence Day in 1972, 25 years after India had gained its independence. Now, for me, this is a very contentious topic, and my intervention somehow would also turn out into being a question to Janice, Paul, and Anna, perhaps, where I would like to, point out to some kind of, some kind of blockades that I have, witnessed, especially while discussing the idea of the Black Arts movement, or imagining the Black Arts movement something that can be extended outside the perimeters of England, specifically looking at interactions between artists in the diaspora, but also artists across Africa and India and South America and the Caribbean. Sheikh Anta Diop, when he came out with his kind of critique of the negative movement, and in the 1970s, Isa Samb, Jibril Diop Mambeti, and others came up with the Laboratoire Agit Art in Dakar. They were imagining a conversation with black populations across the globe. They were thinking about the Dravidians of India, the indigenous people of Australia. They had imagined a conversation and an aesthetic that would be wide and would somehow continue the map of the out of Africa, proposition of Sheikh Anta Diop. And the Dalit Panthers in Bombay began their political existence in solidarity and in reverence of what was happening in America, especially with the civil rights movement, the movements against segregation, and in solidarity with the Black Panther movement there. They also copied the kind of graphic design, typography, and many other elements into their publications here. And there were some people who are now associated to be part of the Black Arts movement. I do not know what was their, to what extent was their inclusion, but historically, or when you come across books on the Black Arts movement, you see the names of few South Asian artists. In India at present, there is not such a certain degree of black consciousness, especially within the kind of elite contemporary art circles, where the idea of South Asian art is extremely guarded and played out because of the reasons that I believe arises from a market-led perspective, where the South Asian art market is booming. It is extremely rich in the manners of speculation that can happen, especially in the sense of art auctions or museum donations and everything. So there isn't any kind of inherent want by the kind of structures that define the South Asian art scene to anyways relate to the British arts, the Black Arts movement in any sense. And so each time when it is proposed, for example, along with various other artists who are part of the Dalit Solidarity Network, we have been trying to explore more and imagine more. It is often blocked. It is often opposed in many senses, because there's also this idea of being brown, which many Dalits disagree with. Dalits, most of the Dalit movements self-identify as black. They would refuse to even imagine this kind of quasi identity as being brown. But it's a very complex situation, because within India, the participation of Dalit artists within the contemporary art scene is extremely feeble. It is entirely defined on levels of accessibility that are defined through language, economic status, and all of this somehow then relates to caste and exclusion based on caste. And I remember, Deborah, when we began speaking to each other in Scotland when we were there in Glasgow, one of the interesting things for me was also to then imagine this conversation specifically with the Caribbean, where the word Dogla became extremely important to me, because Dogla has other kind of interpretation, especially in the north of India here, which means a kind of a half caste, and it's extremely complex, and because we read and we try and grasp many things. It's very difficult for lots of young artists and people in India to travel out, and so the only way of grasping what is happening in Jamaica happens through literature. And when we came across the word Dogla, especially in various amongst various books, etc., and everything, we began to imagine the kind of complexity of the racial divide that exists in the Caribbean, especially in Trinidad or Guyana and other places, where there's a kind of play out between the descendants of the indentured laborers and the Afro-Caribbeans, and so these are the main things that for me then turn into certain questions, and I'm going to leave it here.
Tiffany, within your own research as a curator, what are some of the art histories you have uncovered as it relates to the activities of Black artists in Scotland? We've talked a lot about England. I'd like to hear a bit about other parts of the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking that perhaps in order to start that answering that question, maybe I could speak about where that research came from, and in doing so, perhaps point to some of the reasons why there is this need to uncover in the first place. I work as part of a curatorial duo, and in 2012 we were invited into the archives of the Centre for Contemporary Arts Glasgow as part of an archival show they were doing called What We Have Done, What We're About to Do. And the Centre for Contemporary Arts Glasgow is a very important institution in the city's art scene, and it was founded in the 70s as the Third Eye Centre. And this was really the first point where the archive was re-entering their institution, and they were kind of able to kind of take stock of what they had done. And when we were in the archive, we came across two practitioners who we were already aware of their practices, but hadn't thought so much about their relationship to Glasgow as a city. And those practitioners were Maud Salter and Olodere Bamboig. And one of the things that really struck us in that project was a lack of recognition of their names within our peer group. But that exhibition was thinking about the narratives that we have of the Glasgow art scene, the narratives that we don't have, and it was thinking about proposing or kind of reinserting back into this alternative histories and stories which have been kind of excluded. And that project, in many ways, has opened up a lot of other trajectories and conversations and research avenues. So that exhibition was restaged the following year as part of a different project in a kind of expanded form, and then in 2015 led to a small grant from the Paul Mellon Centre in London to kind of undertake archival and collection research. But I think that if I kind of go back a little bit, I think what we maybe might start to get to a little bit in the conversation is perhaps where some of the difficulties in the kind of chronology that we're talking about in a kind of UK art historical kind of context, where there are perhaps some clashes between kind of the supposed rise of the Glasgow art scene, or like Scottish art historical narratives as a kind of like northern periphery to the UK, taking place at some of the same time as these other chronologies that we're talking about in terms of the Black British art movement. And I feel that somehow these kind of overlapping chronologies is why there are some kind of from Scotland have been some blind spots. Maybe that's me putting it very kindly. But in terms of some of the art histories and practitioners and exhibitions and curatorial projects and dialogues that the research since the end of 2015 with this Paul Mellon grant has allowed for us to uncover. I mean, when we started, we felt that we had quite a good grasp on what had taken place locally in the 1980s and 1990s, and we're curators, we're not really art historians, and so we kind of decided to kind of work backwards by decade, because that seemed kind of fairly that it could be methodical, with the anticipation that once there was this kind of framework in place of what had taken place, that we could then share that information, but as curators that we had a desire to go to return to this and think about things in a more sophisticated manner, hopefully. But I think it's, in terms of the Black Arts movement in the UK, how that relates to London and places like Wolverhampton, it feels like that there are documents, that there is information out there which says what took place. Now, there are things which have obviously received more attention than others, and there are certain things that don't get written into these histories, and some of them were kind of social context. But generally speaking, it's always been my sense that here it's considered that those narratives are off somewhere else, and that there has been no equivalent taking place in Scotland. When I first presented on some of the research that was coming out of the Paul Mellon grant, it was at a panel, a Black British Art Histories panel in 2016 at the annual Art Historians Conference. And Alice Correa, who was chairing it, had said, I was literally, that she was told by an elder art historian that, very categorically, that there were no Black artists in Scottish art history, which is not true, but there seems to have somehow kind of been some currency to that idea until fairly recently. But to talk about some kind of examples, I think that there seems to have really been a really exciting cohort of people, or an exchange between Scotland and the Caribbean taking place from the late 1950s through the 60s and 70s. So it's really interesting to hear Anna speak so much about Hugh Locke, because one of the figures who we've researched is his father, Donald Locke, who comes to Edinburgh to undertake kind of the equivalent of a PhD in a split programme between the university and Edinburgh College of Art, starting in 1959, and he then returns with a British Council research bursary, and at the same time he's also curating projects. He plays in a calypso band. He brings the work of Frank Bowling to Edinburgh for the first time. And then even after he has left for London and then the States, he is still periodically exhibiting in Edinburgh. He participates, for example, in a show called Cone 9 Down, which was the retirement exhibition at the New 57 Gallery, which is very well known in terms of local art histories, of one of his tutors at ECA. So those conversation and links and dialogues seem to be maintained over time, even though he's left. But I mean, I think if I was going to go further back, I could mention someone like Robert Duncan, who's a seminal African-American landscape painter who makes two kind of fairly substantial visits to Scotland in the 1860s. He had much earlier in his career he had wanted to study at the Art Academy in Glasgow, and there is some evidence of there being like some losing of funds in order for him to do so, and I'm not quite clear why that doesn't materialise earlier in his career. But he then later in life makes two trips, and one of those trips he's invited to the Duchess of Argyll's estate to make sketches, to make studies, to produce work. and he has exhibitions while he's here too. And this is kind of very much intertwined with discussions around the abolition of slavery at that time. So, I mean, I think at the moment, our research has been about compiling together some kind of chronology. So, but there are very substantial gaps. I mean, and some, it's not that in some respects that we're finding new information. All that information is out there. In some instances, it's about decontextualizing where that information is and putting it somewhere new and seeing what it means there.
Honey, hello. You're breaking up a little bit. If you could just say your last sentence again, I just missed some of that.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that in some instances, well, that the information that we have been looking at is not new information. It's information that's out there and it's existing, but that in some instances it's more about decontextualizing it to recontextualize it. So taking it from wherever it sits and putting it somewhere new and seeing if it can mean something different or if it can resonate in a different way, if that makes sense. I mean, in terms of the archival and collection research that we've been doing since the end of 2015, many of the items that we've been looking at that pertain to the history of Black artists in Scotland aren't in Scotland. So when we were looking at the conversations that Kenneth Ramchand had with Kamal Braithwaite about establishing an Edinburgh branch of the Caribbean artist movement, those letters are in London. So there's always like a need to kind of look beyond in order to kind of try to bring some of that information back.
Alberta, as an artist belonging to a younger generation coming up after the movement, but also with direct linkages to both Barbados and the UK, do you think the British Black arts movement has been significant in your practice? I'm also quite interested in the work that you recently exhibited at Glasgow's Gallery of Modern Art, titled Inner City. So if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
To a certain degree, I would say yes, the Black British art movement has been significant to my practice, but that link is really quite tenuous. Growing up in the Caribbean and bridging my practice both here and in Scotland means that there've been greater influences to my work because really proximity has played a big part of that. When I was graduating from my BA and just before I began my master's in the late 2000s, I met people, different artists from the Black British art movement when they came to Barbados, and they came for different reasons. There was a big conference on the Black diaspora and the visual arts that happened. So Sonia Boyce, Keith Piper, John Akomfra, and I think Janice came at the same time as well. And meeting those artists and also listening to those conversations and understanding the relationship between my work within a broader transnational history, I found that really compelling. And in some ways it did galvanize my practice, because working in Scotland, I did feel a sense of isolation. I was the only Black student that I was studying. There was no other Black student I was studying with in Edinburgh. And when I did my master's at Glasgow School of Art, again, I was the only artist really asking these questions related to racism or displacement, questions of migration, questions of belonging. It was really only me who was looking at this. And it meant that this isolation and a lack of community, or a lack of almost an ancestral linkage, it did track my work. And also in some ways, I think it inhibited my confidence, because there was no greater generation that I had ready access to within Scotland. Tiffany has spoken a lot around this expectation that Scotland didn't birth any Black artists, and the negative diaspora that she's spoken of, that did have a really significant impact in terms of being able to really kind of track the significance of it in terms of my work. I think it has, because it's allowed me to feel empowered into asking certain questions about place within Britain. But I think that it didn't feel potentially as important to me because I could already track my own ancestry within the Caribbean, where there is a very strong presence of Black and brown artists asking questions, which I was interested in. And when, in terms of trying to locate my practice within that movement, that hasn't really been supported within Scotland.
Well, I want to open up this question a little bit more broadly at this point. Do you see the ripple effects of the Black arts movement in the UK now? Are there young British artists whose work seems particularly resonant or to particularly gesture to that moment? Are there other places, perhaps in the academy? Some of you are working on research projects focused on the archive in this way. How can we see the Black arts movement in the UK today?
I think we're at an interesting kind of moment in the kind of institutional reception of Black British art. So I work at an art school in London, University of the Arts London, where there is a large research project, Black Artists and Modernism, being led by Sonia Boyce, the artist who is obviously a very important part of that history. At University of Central Lancashire, Lubaina Himid, who won the Turner Prize in 2017, also is a professor and leads a big research project called Making Histories Visible. In other words, there are a number of the practitioners who were, part of that movement are now professors, researchers, and are involved very actively in documenting and integrating that history into wider art histories around modernism, around British art, etc. In terms of, I think, in terms of the influence of that on the younger generation, there are younger generations of artists that I've met and that are aware of that history, that are investigating those archives. So, for example, there's a group in London of called Creative Collectivity, people like Evan Ifikoya, Riza Kabir, and others, young artists who work within kind of queer, trans, intersex, people of colour perspectives, and who have done many projects, interviews with people like Keith Piper, Lubaina Himid, Sonia Boyce, and who interrogate those histories, looking at kind of resources, radical resources, to inform their own particular inquiries around identity, etc. So there has been ripple effects there. I would also say that I've worked with artists who perhaps have not necessarily rejected that, but who argue that that work is not as influential in what they're doing. So, for example, I curated an exhibition in Nottingham at New Art Exchange in 2017 with Hansi Momdu-Gordon, where we worked with a younger generation of artists, some of whom, not all, but some of whom said that actually they were more interested, or they were as influenced by, for example, the minimalist work of artists like post-minimalism like Bruce Nauman, or conceptual artists like Sol LeWitt or Adrian Piper. They were as much influenced by that kind of work as they were by Black British artists, right? And there's a kind of sense in which, in some of the artists are trying to establish a different genealogy, a different way of moving beyond the kind of Black British frame and beyond this kind of institutionalized framework. The other point I would make is just to pick up on some of the issues that Sumesh raised and also Tiffany raised about what you might say other histories that are not as prominent in institutionalized retellings of Black art. So, for example, I was speaking with an artist called Hassan Aliyu, who was very much, he was an artist from Nigeria, very active in the 80s and 90s, showed in exhibitions like Creation for Liberation, etc., who worked very much in a kind of painterly style, less conceptual than some of the works that are now well known, and who feels as though some of the work of, for example, Nigerian artists who are working in those styles are not as represented in this kind of institutionalized retelling. There are also, for example, as I think Tiffany might have mentioned, regional histories. I mean, the fact is, Black Art movement were some of the earliest works and artists emerged in the art schools in the Midlands, and the artist groups and collectives from the Midlands, from Birmingham, from Wolverhampton. And yet those regional histories are less prominent, I think, in some of the retelling of these questions. So I think there's also a sense in which, Janice mentioned earlier the diversity of practices, you know, and the ways in which other movements, such as postmodernism, for example, appropriation, styles, art, debates in art practice in the 80s and 90s also played a role on these on artists, Black artists in Britain. But are perhaps these links and debates and questions are kind of submerged beneath a kind of canonical understanding of Black art. So I think there's a kind of rich vein of work that needs to be done to uncover some of these other links, some of these other histories, regional histories, histories of perhaps less conceptual works. So for example, just to give a quick example, I was looking at recently at George Farrakhan Kelly, who was a well-known sculptor at that time, and he's got an amazing website where he's kind of put on the website catalogues of earlier exhibitions, such as, for example, Creation for Liberation. And some of the names that you see there, you rarely hear about. So, for example, who remembers Paul Barrett or Ronald Best, Percival Blake, alongside people like Shyla Berman, etc. Paul Milner, Sharon Moore, Remy Gien, Thomas Joseph, Johnny O'Hee. I mean, there's lots of artists, Rudolph Vaughan, Jude Uzici, from the Seychelles. So there's lots of artists that I think, disappeared, often gave up practice or moved abroad, that we still need to do a bit more research on to kind of uncover those histories. So in a way, I think we've reached at a point where we can celebrate the success of big projects like Black Artists and Modernism, the emphasis on institutional collections and Black artists and collections such as Tate and other museums. But there's a kind of undercommon, there's a kind of underlying history of artworks and practices and styles that I think also need to be researched.
I think building on what Paul was saying, but also what Tiffany began to say about the blind spots, and I think it's important to consider this question of the Black Arts movement in terms of what it did mean regionally, but also what it meant nationally in terms of outside of England, especially in Scotland, where, as Tiffany said, there are these blind spots which have emerged and in some ways are now being looked at through much of the work Tiffany's involved in as mother tongue and also different entities. But what that actually means when space is now being given to share the archives of the Black arts movement. And I mean, I went to the exhibition which Paul curated in Nottingham, and I know that many of my friends and colleagues living in Scotland also tried to go there, and also went to London for Soul of a Nation, went to Bristol for Lubaina Hamid's show, and were really excited when Lubaina's work was being shown as part of Glasgow International. And I think the sense of confidence which that can give young artists who might not necessarily identify with the Black British art movement in terms of developing their own practice, which really reveals their own interiority and not feeling a sense of being marginalized in terms of, as has been spoken of within the conversation, the exteriority of being considered within a movement of blackness or Black violence or the Black body, and actually thinking about the day-to-dayness of what their multiple experiences are as Black and brown artists living outside of the metropolis. What does it mean to be making art as a young Asian woman in Scotland? You know, does she feel necessarily part of that movement? I'm not sure, but I think there is really a space for witnessing these archives and witnessing these movements.
The Black Arts movement in the 1980s actually encompassed, Black was a political term. So Mona Hatoum, who's a Palestinian artist, Rashid Areen, Sitpa Biswas would have considered themselves and call themselves Black artists. What we notice now within the 21st century is that term has been used specifically to talk about people or artists of African descent. And I think that is always going to be a problem, because they are being used interchangeably, but actually they mean very specific things at very specific moments. And I think it was interesting that Tiffany didn't talk about Alia Said, who very much, when she was based in London, has been exhibited under the Black Arts banner. So I think that there are problems which need to be worked out within the researchers. As a member of the Panchayat archive, which has moved to the Tate, I think there are issues around what Paul Call talks about, in terms of there are a whole range of artists, whole range of practices, but actually partly because documentation, or that they're not showing in prestigious galleries, or they're not being talked about. There are lots of artists who are kind of outside, who fall outside those histories in relationship to how you construct a notion of what that history is. And I think there's also, in terms of the British experience, there's also another shift, which is specifically around demographics, that the Caribbean community, which in terms of lots of the Black artists we're talking about, is very much smaller. The communities that we're now talking about are very different from the communities who gave rise to the Black Arts movement. So that definition of race, identity, migration patterns are very different, and that they give rise to a different way of thinking about that. So those are questions of that. And also we have a much larger population who would describe themselves as dual heritage emerging, and what that means, how they negotiate those very fluid and flexible identities are going to be very interesting in terms of how those issues are not really being discussed. And I think that those will raise the problems of how those histories are read and reflected. I think that we're seeing a lot of young collectives emerging, like the Women of Colour Index, who are working or started working with the Women of Colour Index, which was begun by the artist Rita Keegan, who are very much looking into those archives. And they actually bring together young people to read material from the archive, to talk about both their own practices, but also their own and different experiences. So I think that there are lots of issues going, but there's also a danger of nostalgia, I think, that we're looking at a golden age. And I think that really needs to be marked against. That these movements came out of a very particular set of circumstances and very particular kind of histories. And there is how they're reworked within kind of contemporary practices, I think, really have to be looked at critically, and rather than something which is kind of held up as a golden age. Speaking directly to Shames, like for example, my mother grew up would be described, and she wouldn't describe herself, but it was described as a Douglas. That whole idea of what Caribbeanness in the UK, which is very much always talked about as Afro-Caribbean now, doesn't really fit into that very kind of creolized identity of what the Caribbean is. And I think that in one sense is what attracted me to the Black Arts movement, was that very fluid notion of Blackness, which didn't put me, or where I had to deny one part of my family in order to claim a kind of identity around Blackness. So I think that those are issues which I think need to both be reflected back, but also forward in a kind of very critical unnostalgic way when we read the histories. And I think the relationship for younger artists is always going to be one of disconnect and perhaps a distancing, and the work is almost intangible of how it may speak to them. So I think that what Alberto is talking about is almost a kind of like a critical way of thinking about the work.